The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Welcome to day 2 of the Kingston Conference on International Security. I'm your Master of Ceremonies, Colonel Trevor Teller, visiting Defence Fellow from the Queen's University Centre for International and Defence Policy. The theme of this year's conference is In Case of Emergency, the military's role in the pandemic and future crises. Today's panels will build on those themes we spoke of yesterday, how the pandemic has shocked our organizations and has forced a reframing of our perspectives, how we've had to revisit the regulations, policies, processes, and practice that enable the military response during a crisis, or sometimes hinder it. Today, we will broaden those topics by discussing COVID-19 and Canadian national security, as well as allied experiences. Before I introduce Dr. Tardy for opening comments, a few administrative points. Simultaneous translation is available this morning. You can access that by selecting the small globe on the bottom right of your screen. Additionally, the question and answer function can be found at the top of your Zoom screen, and we invite, indeed need, your questions for our panels. And I wouldn't be doing my duties if I didn't put in a shameless plug for our website and Twitter handle, #KCIS and kcis.org, where you can find this year and last year's conferences, as well as the biographies of our presenters today. Panel this morning is COVID-19 pandemic and the Canadian national security. To provide opening comments, it's Dr. Tardy. Dr. Tardy is Director of Research Division at the NATO Defence College in Rome. He's previously held senior research and management positions at the EU Institute for Security Studies, at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and the Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris. His fields of expertise include NATO policy and adaptation, European Union Common Security and Defence Policy, NATO-EU relations, and the politics of crisis management. He's published 6 books and over 100 articles and book chapters. It is our pleasure to have him with us today. Dr. Tardy, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's my genuine pleasure to welcome all of you to the second day of the 2021 edition of the Kingston Conference on International Security, this year dealing with the military's role in the pandemic and future crisis. The NATO Defence College is partnering with the consortium, the Kingston Consortium, and Queen's University. And I'd like to congratulate and thank very warmly Stephanie von Latke for her fantastic work and dedication to this endeavor, and also thank the team that was involved in the organization of this event. So yesterday we had a great start with Stephanie and with General Eyre, and also with our first panel, where we started to reflect on the new environment, what it means for the concept of threat, the concept of security, the kinds of lessons learned processes that we should engage in, but also the implications for our armed forces in Canada and beyond. I'd like to take this opportunity to flag a publication that the NATO Defence College released last year, titled COVID-19, NATO in the Age of Pandemics, where we did look at a number of consequences of the pandemic for the way we approach threats and security policies. So today we continue our exploration with guest speakers and then the second panel. I wish us all a great second day, fruitful discussions, so that this event has a real impact on our way of thinking and our way of doing. Thanks to all of you, and I hand over back to Colonel Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tardy. It's now my pleasure to introduce our chair for the first guest speaker panel, Dr. Carol Evans. Dr. Evans is a Director of Strategic Studies Institute at the United States Army Warfare College, at the USAWC. Prior to joining the college, Dr. Evans was a Senior Program Manager, National Security Global Business Division with the Battelle Memorial Institute. Her operational experience includes deployments with the US Navy 3rd Fleet and US Pacific Fleet. She's held a variety of faculty and research positions, including Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, University of California, Berkeley, Harvard, Washington University, St. Louis, and the Brookings Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Evans to the panel this morning.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased and delighted to introduce this particular panel. Intelligence has been a big area of my own research and have actively worked within the United States within that community too. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a brief thumbnail in terms of what this panel is about, and then I'll very briefly introduce the speakers. As you know, you've got bios, they're full bios. I'm not going to read from them, but I'll just give you a snapshot of each of our three speakers for today's panel. So let me just give you an introduction then in terms of what the topic of this is. And we're really focusing on the role of Canada's intelligence and the national security community in dealing with COVID-19. And this has been a topic that not only in Canada, but certainly in the United States has been widely debated. What is this particular role since the onset of the pandemic? And some have described its emergence as an intelligence failure or a failure of early warning. Others, however, note that the role of intelligence and national security in health matters is and should remain limited. It is also clear that traditional national security threats are evolving rapidly during the pandemic. There are concerns in particular about the rise, for example, we heard yesterday, of extremist violence, as well as cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns. So this raises several urgent questions. Should Canadian intelligence agencies engage in health intelligence? Do they have the tools and mandates to do so without compromising the law and the privacy of Canadians? How are threats evolving and what are the challenges encountering them in a pandemic? What lessons has the intelligence community learned during the pandemic? So in this presentation, the three presenters will discuss these issues in their forthcoming co-edited book. We're going to start first with Dr. Leah West. She practices and studies and publishes in the field of national security law. She completed her SJD at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law in 2020. And she is also the national administrator of the Canadian National Grounds of the Philip C. Jessup International Law Moot, quite a mouthful, and serves as counsel with Friedman Mansour LLP. Her research explores the application of criminal, constitutional, and international law to state conduct in cyberspace. So welcome, Leah. Our second speaker on this co-edited book project is Dr. Thomas Juneau, and he is Associate Professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. His research focuses on the Middle East, on the role of intelligence and national security, on foreign policy making, on Canadian foreign and defense policy, and on international relations theory. He is a non-resident fellow with the Sanaa Center for Strategic Studies. From 2003 until 2014, he worked with Canada's Department of National Defense as a policy analyst covering the Middle East. And then our final speaker on this panel is Dr. Amaranth Amarasingam, and he is assistant professor in the School of Religion and is cross-appointed to the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University, where KCS is located, obviously, in Ontario, Canada. He is senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and an associate fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. He is author of Pain, Pride, and Politics, Sri Lankan Tamil Activism in Canada, and the co-editor of Sri Lanka, The Struggle for Peace in the Aftermath of War. Welcome, all three speakers. It's a delight to have this panel today. Over to you, Dr. West.
Thanks, and I'm just going to say, because if Jitsia gets mentioned and Nipsia doesn't, you know, my heart melts. So in my day job, I'm an assistant professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, rival to my colleague Thomas School in Ottawa. And thank you so much for having us. As Carol mentioned, the role of Canada's intelligence and national security community has been widely debated since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. This book arose from that debate that many of us were wading into in the early weeks of the debate. Some in the camp argued that Canada should expand its mandates in security and intelligence to monitor and respond to global health threats, while others, many of those who joined us in the book, argue that the role of intelligence in national security matters should remain limited. Pandemics, traditionally a public health issue with national security consequences, not a national security issue in and of itself. But as we all know, it has had, this pandemic has had huge implications for how our national security and intelligence community functions, operates, and the threats it's dealing with. Carol posed or spoke to a number of the questions that really spawned the research at issue in our book. And in the summer of 2020, we, along with several others, set out to answer the questions in partnership with the Privy Council's Office's Intelligence Assessment Secretariat, or IAS. I'm sure many of you are familiar, but for those of you who are not, IAS is a central unit tasked with providing nonpartisan all-source analysis to the Prime Minister, Cabinet, and the broader federal government. It produces intelligence assessments on a wide range of topics, including, since March 2020, the government's response to the pandemic. We felt it was really important to talk to those at the center of the response to understand the inner workings of the national security and intelligence community in the response to the pandemic, and to help this guide our research and our research questions. We held a roundtable with senior officials from across the national security and intelligence community, organized in partnership with PCO-IAS, to discuss the challenge that they had been facing 6 months into the pandemic. We didn't quite know at that time quite how long things would continue for. We thought 6 months was maybe the halfway point. Following this broad conversation, and as the situation evolved, several researchers who authored chapters in our forthcoming text, which I should say is called Stress Tested, continued the discussion with relevant government officials on a direct basis. Ultimately, these discussions spawned the research questions that each author set off to answer in the text. Today, we want to present the high-level findings of the text, which combines insight from intelligence studies, political science, international relations, sociology, public health, and of course, law. I'll begin by briefly looking at the issue of preparedness. I'll then turn it over to Amar to discuss the change in the threat landscape. And Tamal will conclude by identifying the key lessons learned during the pandemic and those that should be taken into the future. We do believe that these findings provide us with a deeper understanding of how intelligence and the security community can improve and better integrate its capabilities into the federal efforts to prepare, identify, manage, and respond to public health and welfare emergencies. Just before I move on, we use the term public welfare emergency throughout because this is the term used in the Federal Emergencies Act to capture not just pandemics, but any emergency caused by real or imminent fire, flood, drought, storm, earthquake, or natural phenomenon, disease in both human beings, animals, and plants, and accident or pollution, and that can result in danger to life or property, social disruption, or the breakdown of flow of essential goods, services, or resources, so serious as to be a national emergency. While certainly the COVID-19 pandemic did meet this definition, we know that the National Emergencies Act was never invoked. So on the issue of preparedness, one of the questions repeatedly asked in the early stages of the pandemic was how ready was the national security and intelligence community to respond, not only to respond to, but operate within a public welfare emergency. We're not journalists. I think the three of us consider ourselves optimistic realists. So in answering this question, we thought it was important not to set an impossible standard. To some extent, the pandemic has been a unique and unprecedented crisis for which no government could have been reasonably expected to be fully prepared. Nevertheless, security agencies understand that the world is unpredictable, I should say, and it is undeniably appropriate to expect them to be planning for a range of contingencies. After all, they generally are in the business of foresight and future analysis. So not surprisingly, when the pandemic struck, many agencies and departments were actually ready to implement business continuity plans that they had already prepared. However, as meticulous as any of these plans may have been, they certainly did not survive unscathed with their first contact with the virus. As Stephanie Carvin found, these plans were often quite helpful at the early stages in helping senior officials rapidly identify critical missions that had to continue even with reduced staffing levels and determine who within the staff was critical in responding to those missions. However, those business continuity plans were of little use in guidance for more tactical decisions that had actual practical impacts on being able to deal with the mission, like how to manage new public health and sanitation requirements inside a SCIF, for example. What about defense? As you heard from General Eyre yesterday, the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces had a detailed counter-pandemic contingency plan, which was activated and became known as Operation Laser. In fact, I recall both Tama and I being briefed on the implementation of Operation Laser in the very early days of the pandemic. This preparation is not surprising, given that the CAF's very nature demands it to be ready to operate in a crisis environment. If they hadn't had one ready, we certainly would have been asking questions. Now, Jim Cox identified that in the defense intelligence space, which has received a high degree of scrutiny since the early days of the pandemic, this preparation was primarily driven along two lines of operation. First, focusing on forced protection, integrity, and effectiveness, and the second one providing military support to civilian authorities. According to Cox, this preparedness allowed the defense intelligence enterprise to adapt rapidly and, after important adjustments, meet its priority intelligence requirements. Now, the question of whether the CAF provided sufficient early warning to policymakers based on what they knew when and what those policymakers did with that information was not subject to speculative conjecture in our book. To be sure, this is an important question that absolutely must be explored if we are to learn from it. And we believe, at least I certainly believe, that requires full and transparent review of government action, not just the CAF, but across very relevant agencies. However, we did not explore this because we simply don't believe we have the information to date to make an appropriate assessment of this issue. So in general, we found that the national security intelligence community was ready to some extent to face the pandemic. However, there are other areas that were caught off guard that do have significant implications for Canadian national security. So those agencies and issues that are tangentially related to national security that do ultimately have a significant impact on Canadian security writ large. First, supply chains. Various supply chains were disrupted, manufacturing, food, agricultural, PPE, etc. Not all were affected equally. Carvin and a number of her students from Carleton's Infrastructure Protection and International Security Program studied these issues and proposed a reason for this discrepancy being corporate knowledge within the government. They found the federal government regularly intervenes in and regulates supply chains within the agriculture and food sector and is familiar with its operations, and that familiarity likely assisted the government in making changes to rules and regulations around foreign workers, for example, and product packaging. In contrast, the evidence suggests that before the pandemic, the government was unfamiliar with the manufacturing sector as it relates to PPE, despite the SARS pandemic that hit Canada 17 years earlier. In the sense, it could not make quick changes nor understand the impact of certain decisions, such as those related to quality management, on access to PPE and materials. However, if there is a success in the PPE story, it's that Canadian officials were able to lean on their international counterparts to ensure some level of supply, but we can hardly attribute this to government preparedness, knowledge of, or familiarity with the manufacturing sector. Turning now to the legal system, Mike Nesbitt and Tara Hansen identified 3 systemic challenges in criminal law that the COVID pandemic exposed. Criminal justice system was stress tested by the pandemic due to an increase in certain types of criminal behavior and the introduction of new public health regulations that needed to be enforced through the criminal justice system. Second, as Amara will explore, Canada saw a rise in ideologically motivated extremism, especially the far right, and conspiracy-driven threats that the law enforcement community is not necessarily prepared to, or did not understand how to investigate this threat. Third, a shift occurred in the context of this shift occurred in the context of an already overstretched criminal justice and national security apparatus. We already had a strained criminal justice system that had to respond to increased security threats while operating with fewer resources because of the imposition of pandemic-related public health measures. In short, the cracks in a broken justice system were exacerbated by the pandemic, and the resulting backlog and pull in focus will extend far beyond the pandemic itself. Several unanswered legal questions that have been at the forefront of the legal debate in this country, not just since the pandemic, but over the last decade, if not more, but have yet to be dealt with sufficiently because I would argue they are politically unpalatable discussions, did hamper potential government responses to the pandemic. This is what I studied in my chapter. And here I'm referring to questions of lawful access and question about who owns personal data and what your ownership rights to data are. These questions are at the heart of the debate when it came to the government surveillance and data collection for contract tracing and public health public health and quarantine enforcement. And failure to address these questions in times of stability or peacetime ended up tying the hands of the government in a time of crisis. Finally, the work of Adam Sahul and Diana Reyes argues that the pandemic has shown a light on specific public health, economic, and political challenges facing minority communities, including migrants and refugees in Canada. In their view, the government was not prepared to understand the disproportionate impact the pandemic would have on these communities, notably because of the unavailability of ethnic and racial demographic breakdowns of COVID-19 incidences and mortality. Without that data, government could not build a more holistic view of the security challenges facing these communities. And with that, I'll turn it over to Amar.
Thanks, Leah. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the broader threat landscape in Canada, but with a focus on, I mean, there's a lot we could talk about. We could talk about Afghanistan. We could talk about the rise in ISIS attacks in places like in parts of Africa and so on. But I'm going to focus a bit on some of the takeaways, particularly in the COVID space and the impact that COVID had on two particular things. One is the rise of conspiracy theories, which my chapter and Marc-Andre Argentino's chapter focuses on, and the rise of kind of hate speech, the decline in social trust, and what's happening in the far right space, both of which are related in some way, but I'll focus just on those two for the sake of time. So one of the things we noticed quite early on is the prevalence of conspiracy theories around the pandemic. So you had established terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, for example, interpreting what the pandemic meant. This ranged from ISIS kind of dabbling in its own conspiracy theories around the virus being created in a lab initially, and then moving on to much more kind of general arguments about it being divine punishment for Western attacks on the caliphate, and similar arguments along those lines. Strictly in the conspiracy space, you had a variety of approaches very early on. The far right very kind of prematurely, I think, made the argument, or some in the far right made the argument that this was only going to affect people in China because of their genetic deficiencies, and white people are obviously genetically superior, etc. Once the virus very quickly moved out of China, that argument was shelved, as you can imagine. But a lot of other arguments started to pop up. One, that the virus was somehow linked to 5G towers. You saw several incidents of people tampering with and trying to destroy 5G towers in parts of Quebec and in parts of Europe. A second argument was that this was a kind of bioweapon, that the virus was manufactured in a lab for malevolent reasons. Third, that it was a kind of tool that was going to be used by governments for social control. Some of that is still prevalent, and encouragement on some forums that the chaos that's resulting from the pandemic should be taken advantage of for recruitment and mobilization, mobilizing to violence. And so that argument, particularly on the far right space, is also still pretty prevalent. In our chapter in particular, mine and Marc-André's, we look at QAnon because it's a particularly useful example of how the rise of COVID conspiracy theories really boosted other movements and ideas as well, right? And you'll recall for your purposes in terms of the military, the QAnon worldview places a mass amount of importance on the role of the military in eventually, as they believe, reinstating Trump to power, dismantling the deep state. That whole process is basically, in their view, a kind of military coup, right? A military takeover to dismantle the deep state and reinstate Trump to power. And so the role of QAnon in these conspiracy theories was quite important. Right around March 2020, and we show this in the chapter quite clearly with focus on Facebook pages. We saw QAnon Facebook pages and groups basically go through the roof in terms of membership as well as post frequency, just at the March 2020 quarantine lockdown period. And what happened here was that COVID conspiracy theories and criticisms around what the government was doing were so popular that basically whoever echoed these ideas, whoever said the same things as these conspiracy theorists basically also got a boost as well. So whether it was from far-right groups, whether it was QAnon accounts, whether it was anti-government movements, militia movements, Stop the Steal movements in the US, everything kind of got a boost and everyone kind of rode the COVID conspiracy wave, so to speak. And we very much saw a kind of mainstreaming of this kind of conspiratorial thinking. Ideas fairly seamlessly moved from the dark corners of the internet, dark corners of social media, to become much more widespread. And this worried us in many ways because research after research shows that the prevalence of conspiratorial thinking doesn't just kind of exist online and then disappear. It has real world consequences. People are less likely to vote. People are less likely to donate money. People are less likely to volunteer. People are less likely to vaccinate their kids, and so on. So the belief in conspiracy theories actually does have an impact in how people behave and go about their day. So the second takeaway I'll leave you with is the impact that COVID had on the far right space and on hate speech and the decline of social trust more generally. We cite a study in the chapter by Tomas Oleksy and colleagues. They looked at kind of the prevalent, whether the presence of conspiratorial beliefs impacted how people, whether people adopted preventive measures recommended by public health, and also whether they supported xenophobic policies that the government put into place. And so there are two studies conducted in Poland. We cite some other studies in the chapter as well, but this one with a sample of 2,700 participants basically found that belief in COVID conspiracies in particular was correlated with the acceptance of xenophobic policies. And also, if you believe that kind of there's a nefarious intent behind the COVID-19 pandemic, that you were less likely to obviously accept public health recommendations. In terms of hate speech, according to some studies, there were about 1,150 cases of racist attacks from March 10th, 2020 to February 28th, 2021. Unsurprisingly, about 84% of the targets were East Asian, about 60% of the targets were women. Like with the first takeaway, a lot of these far-right ideas and hate speech also became much more mainstreamed as they kind of piggybacked on online content, such as those against the vaccine mandate and those against lockdowns. And again, because COVID became kind of the common topic that a variety of these groups and movements were talking about, it brought people into contact with different ideas that they probably would not have otherwise had access to. If you kind of remember or think back to when jihadist content was removed from mainstream platforms back in 2015, they moved to smaller platforms, moved to more exclusive platforms like Telegram, and then they were eventually removed from there also a few years later. This is not happening with the far right and kind of the hate content on the far right, right? So when groups moved from, when they were removed from Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, in 2019, 2020, 2021, for the most part, they moved to Gab or platforms like Gab and Telegram. where far-right content is basically thriving, right? And part of the problem here is that some of these platforms like Gab and Parler were themselves created by far-right actors. So obviously they're not coming to the table with other major platforms to have conversations around takedown and conversations around deplatforming. I'm currently in 5 far-right groups on Telegram, for example, with tens of thousands of members. I'm in QAnon groups on Telegram and Gab with over 230,000 members, which are numbers that we never saw on the jihadist side of things, right? And so the kind of impact they had on the mainstream platforms, they've basically been able to replicate that on more exclusive platforms or smaller platforms, which has been quite surprising. What basically happened here, as I mentioned, is that anger around the vaccines and lockdowns really became kind of the common point of conversation for a whole host of different ideological groups and movements. And if you were just a kind of random person angry about the lockdowns, and then you entered Telegram channels or Gab channels, just on that particular issue, you now had access to conversations that you weren't really part of before about, you know, anti-Semitic content, anti-government rhetoric, calls for Trudeau to be assassinated, neo-Nazi content, militia movements, and so on. And so I think the pandemic not only boosted all these conspiracy theories, but also served as the common point of contact for ideologically disparate movements that are now finding themselves in the same place. So I'll stop there, hand it over to Mo.
Thank you very much, Amar and Leah, and thank you to the organizers. So Leah focused on the readiness of the national security and intelligence community when the pandemic started. Amar then shifted to the issue of threats. And now I will finish with 2 sections, one on adjustment, so a bit more on how the community adjusted to the evolving threat environment, and then a few points on lessons learned to the future. So first of all, on adjustments, the pandemic forced the national security and intelligence community to adapt a lot. But a consistent finding in our book throughout a lot of the chapters is that the pandemic led to completely new initiatives or new things, basically, but also accelerated changes that were already taking place inside the community. And I'll give a few examples of that. So for example, it forced departments and agencies to accelerate their adoption and their use of certain technologies, to change their management of human resources practices, and also to increase engagement with new partners inside the government, but also outside the government. Most obviously, just to begin, the community had to revise expectations of what it could do and what it could not do on the analytical front, on the operational front, and so on. It had to target resources, especially human resources, that were suddenly limited towards critical priorities. So collection, analysis, dissemination of intelligence could not continue at a normal pace. Less essential activities had to be abandoned. But also more resources had to be thrown at new priorities. Think about, for example, threats to the vaccine supply. The precise impact, obviously, on the community's departments and agencies varied a lot. For example, and Leah briefly mentioned this, Jim Cox's chapter on the Defense Intelligence Enterprise discusses in a fair bit of detail, and he bases this on interviews with people in the Canadian Forces Intelligence Command on how they conducted the reprioritization exercise. What were the criteria that guided this reprioritization exercise? On the analytical side, for example, managers, senior managers delegated lower down the chain decisions on what products, what strategic intelligence products were essential, which ones were not, and therefore who had to come into the office, whether the ceiling was at 20 or 30 or 50% of staff to work on classified systems, to work on these products. Another key theme that emerged throughout the book is human resources, which is something that academics tend to neglect a fair bit, but as anybody here inside the government knows, is obviously incredibly important. Again, looking at the defense intelligence side, there was a very difficult balance to strike between evolving and fast-changing intelligence priorities, but also sanitary measures, which capped the number of employees in the office, but also the needs of employees, some of which, those with children, those with sick family members, in many cases could not come to the office. So there were very difficult dilemmas to deal with. Another key theme that arises throughout the chapters is the issue of IT. IT staff, in many cases, especially early on, but still today, were the unsung heroes of the pandemic, or among the unsung heroes of the pandemic, because they had to work incredibly hard early on to manage remote work and everything that comes with that. So in one chapter, for example, by Bill Robinson, we look a fair bit at the efforts by CSC, and more specifically, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, which played a key role in managing in helping and providing advice on all of this remote work dimension. Another theme that is central throughout the book is the issue of open source intelligence. And this is a good example of a trend that predates the pandemic, but that was accelerated by the pandemic. Before the pandemic, already a lot of debate in the intelligence community on the value of open source information, what role open source intelligence should play in terms of the broader spectrum of types of intelligence that are gathered, that are analyzed and disseminated. The pandemic has really fundamentally changed this debate. Obviously, with analysts and others working from home, they had little choice than consuming anything else than open source information, but then also to write unclassified products and circulate them. So in some of the various book chapters, including one by Stephanie Carvin, we look at efforts by CSIS and the Intelligence Assessment Staff Secretariat, at PCO, the Privy Council Office, who had a number of unclassified products like that they circulated. Another trend that I want to mention that also predates the pandemic, but that was wildly accelerated by the pandemic, is the issue of relations between the intelligence community and what we call non-traditional partners. So for example, think about relations between CSC and Elections Canada to deal with foreign electoral interference. Relations between CSIS and others, and Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada to deal with foreign investments that have national security concerns. These are relations that were developing fast before the pandemic that in many cases did not even exist, say 5 or 10 years ago, but that had to massively accelerate during the pandemic. CSIS and CSC, for example, really expanded their ability to work with universities or with private sector research companies that work in vaccine development, for example, because of the growing, fast-growing threat as soon as the pandemic began of economic espionage. CSC, for example, provided cybersecurity advice and services to public and private health institutions, notably those involved in vaccine research, vaccine development, and other critical activities. These are not relationships that did not exist before in many cases, but that have had to ramp up on a far larger scale very quickly. CSIS has an academic and stakeholder engagement unit, for example, that only in 2020 gave more than 400 thread briefings to private sector actors, which is a really big deal when you think about it and realize that this is not something that happened on anything comparable to that scale only a few years ago. Last point that I'll mention on the themes in the book in how the community had to adjust is the issue of mental health. Not an issue that we go deep in the book, that we explore deeply in the book because we don't have the expertise for that, but it is a theme that really emerged through most of the chapters, that managers in the intelligence community had to deal with major mental health concerns with their employees. I think everybody here understands where that came from, but this is not something they were well equipped for, and this is a challenge that will continue after the pandemic. To conclude, I just want to make a few points on the future. The national security community learned a lot of lessons during the pandemic, started doing things differently, in some cases completely differently. So that raises really interesting questions. Some of these lessons will be jettisoned when the pandemic slowly subsides, but maybe some of these lessons are useful for the future. So it is valid, and we do that in the conclusion to the book, to try to think about some of these lessons learned that might have relevance for a post-pandemic world. One, obviously, is the issue of remote work. The pandemic has shown that it is possible, even in the intelligence community. Some staff work with unclassified stuff on a daily basis. They can work from home at least some of the time. But even staff, whether analysts or officers or others who work in a more classified environment, in some cases, they are able to work maybe 1 or 2 days a week from home. And there are benefits to that from an environmental perspective, from a mental health perspective, and probably from an efficiency perspective too, though that remains a matter of debate. Another theme looking forward, Leah touched on this, so I will not get into detail on this, but it's the issue of health intelligence. What is the role of the intelligence community in dealing with health intelligence? Should it be a priority, or should it remain a priority for the Public Health Agency of Canada, but with the intelligence community looking a bit more at the implications of health emergencies, such as threats to vaccine supplies, for example? This is not an issue of either or. There's a continuum on multiple files, but certainly a debate that will continue. Another lesson that will be very important looking forward is the point I mentioned a couple minutes ago, which is relations with non-traditional partners. Some of these relations will diminish and in some cases disappear once the pandemic is over. But clearly, if you look at the main threats that Canada faces in the future, foreign economic espionage, foreign electoral interference, and none of them the intelligence community deals with them alone. And that was a problem, that was a challenge before the pandemic, to work more closely with other governmental actors, but also non-governmental actors in subnational levels of government, in the private sector, in universities, and so on. The intelligence community had a massive crash course in dealing with non-traditional partners during the pandemic, and we can only hope that some of these relations will continue, but more important, some of lessons in how to work with non-traditional partners like that will be retained and used in the future. Finally, and I'll finish on this, the pandemic has forced the community to think hard about burden sharing with allies and partners. Especially in Jim Cox's chapter on the Defense Intelligence Enterprise, he gives good examples of how the Defense Intelligence side, Canadian Forces Intelligence Command, but others too, had to, because they had no choice, because of a shortage of human resources, work even more closely than they used to with allies, especially the Five Eyes, to burden share. So for example, for daily briefs, for assessment products, to really say, okay, you country A, you look at this, country B, you look at this. And even in some cases overnight, they were able to share the information so that products could be circulated in the morning for decision makers in partner countries. Of course, this is something that happened a lot before the pandemic, but it happened even more in a more effective way during the pandemic. So there are interesting lessons to carry forward here too. So to wrap up, a lot of lessons learned during the pandemic. We only scratched or looked at the tip of the iceberg because the pandemic is not over, but also because, of course, even though we had good access, interviews, roundtables, we don't have access to a lot of what has been going on. So our hope is that there will be a lessons learned exercise, not only internally to the community, but also that some elements of this lessons learned exercise will be public, whether through oversight and review bodies, or some elements will be published and discussed so that Canadians as a whole, civil society, the media, and academics have an idea of what those lessons are. And on that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a number of questions already coming in, but I invite our participants, please use the chat function to bring your questions to the different speakers. And if you have someone specifically you want the question going to, let me know that as well. But I have a first question in, and I'll just go ahead and read it. And this is a question for the entire panel. And that is, what lessons can be applied in a future pandemic that is more lethal than COVID, and efforts to produce a vaccine are less effective in an era of misinformation, disinformation that threatens state stability? So, imagining ahead, more lethality, less effectiveness, what kinds of challenges might that provide for the intelligence community? Over. So we could
something quickly on just one issue, and that is if we're the issue of contact tracing and the issue of health enforcement of health measures, which I think we can all agree based on what we've seen in terms of the statistics, in terms of who downloaded the COVID Alert app, how effective that was, and how effective we've actually been at enforcing the law, the public health laws and quarantine measures. These are, ultimately in terms of response, it's important for national security, but certainly enforcement was not a priority. And I think if we're dealing with a situation that is much more lethal, we're going to need to revisit that issue. We're also going to need to revisit this volunteer voluntary basis upon which we engage in contract tracing, right? Realistically, except for in the very rare exceptions, provision of information was either voluntary or up to enforcement by local businesses, etc. You know, if we're dealing with something that is much more serious, we may need to see harsher or more stricter reliance on surveillance tools. And I don't mean surveillance tools necessarily those that we would typically use in the intelligence community, but those adapted to deal with this kind of pandemic. And we need to think about that ahead of time, not in the moment, because we don't do a very good job of thinking through those bigger privacy implications, the bigger issues around enforcement, the managing, the balancing of these issues in the moment. These things need to be thought of in advance, and that's one of the things that we call for, especially I call for in my chapter, is we got lucky that contract tracing and enforcement wasn't necessary to stem or you know, stem the flatten the curve in the pandemic long term, but that won't necessarily always be the case.
Amar or Tom, any comments as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of for me in the misinformation space, or the kind of the response side of things, I think one of the things that surprised me right off the bat was how quickly even the most mundane aspects of the public health response became politicized, right? And so you had masks, vaccines, lockdowns, etc. Everything became kind of everything became a yelling match, right? And I think going forward, particularly in preparation for the next inevitable pandemic, I think learning how to turn down the temperature a bit and is going to be quite important. And whether that's, you know, kind of cliched things like digital literacy or education around misinformation, I think all of those will be important. On the other hand, I think it's important to stay also the kind of fear around vaccine hesitancy, particularly at least in Ontario, and for the most part, most of Canada, wasn't as bad as I think people thought it was going to be, right? I think the numbers, we were expecting hesitancy to be much higher than it is. I mean, Ontario is now 84% double vaxxed, and if you look at above 12. And so, and numbers did increase after the mandates. You know, you kind of put incentive structures in place so that you can't go to certain places without vaccines, and all of a sudden the numbers go through the roof. I think all of those tools are important to kind of have in our toolbox going forward whenever the next pandemic hits.
Sorry, can I just jump in and say one more thing on this before I turn it to Tama? And Amar's point about the politicization of this, I think, is important, because I don't think any politician is going to forget the politicization of these issues moving forward. We got very, very lucky that the premiers of all of and leaders of all of our territories and provinces played ball early, right? They understood the issues. They did not politicize response for the most part. You had consistent and uniform responses early on to the severity of the crisis and what needed to be done. We saw that changed as the course of the pandemic changed and these issues became politicized. But the federal government got lucky and never relied on the Federal Emergencies Act. It didn't need to, because I think you didn't see the politicization in the very early days of the pandemic. But I fear that by not invoking the Emergencies Act, federalizing certain elements of response in this pandemic will make it even harder in the future to do it. And I don't think we're going to get as lucky, because I think politicians are going to remember the lessons learned of the political wins and losses that arise from pandemics and whatnot. And, you know, they may not all play ball early on, and we may have created a really challenging precedent to overcome about when the federal government is actually going to be prepared to invoke the Emergencies Act.
We have another question, if I may just jump in. This, I think, would go to Tom in terms of your discussion about effective burden sharing. You know, you were talking about increased cooperation among the Five Eyes. And so one of the questions is, what evidence was found to support this view? You know, where is that evidence that this has become much more effective? If you can perhaps provide some examples. Over.
Very good question. So, you know, my presentation was an overview of a lot of the key themes in the book, so I only scratched the surface without getting into the details. So that's absolutely a fair question. The main chapter in the book that discusses that is the one that focuses on the Defense Intelligence Enterprise and on Canadian Forces Intelligence Command. And that chapter was written by Jim Cox, who is a retired brigadier general with a lot of experience in that field. What Mr. Cox did was that he interviewed, and I don't have the manuscript in front of me, I think it is 4 individuals, 4 leaders on the civilian and military side in Canadian Forces Intelligence Command, and they described, to the extent that they could, but when you're talking about process, it's actually quite feasible to have a discussion at the unclassified level. They described some of these processes that they put, that they tried to establish early on during the pandemic with mostly the Five Eyes. To try to compensate for the fact that everybody was short-staffed, so it was not realistic to expect the same level of production in a context where the threat level was evolving but not diminishing, and demands were still very high, demands on intelligence products, on assessments, and so on. So what evidence do we have to support that view? In Jim Cox's chapter, which is the main chapter that discusses this, the evidence is his interviews and his assessment of those interviews. Is that sufficient evidence to come to fully definitive conclusions? No, of course, with time, when the dust settles after the pandemic, hopefully ourselves and others will be able to look deeper into this to better understand why these things happen, how they happen, to try to come to a more fine-grained conclusion of the successes that were achieved and not achieved in some cases. So at this point, this conclusion definitely has to be read as preliminary, as are a lot of the points in this book. But I do personally absolutely accept that assessment that Mr. Cox came to in that chapter. It's a really interesting point because, you know, Canada, if you take a few steps back from the pandemic only, Canada has a fairly small intelligence community, at least when you compare it to the bigger members of the Five Eyes, the US, but even the UK. We can't do everything on our own. For that matter, the US can't do everything on its own, despite the absolutely massive size of its intelligence community. Allies and partners in the intelligence world cooperate, burden share on analysis, on collection, on operations. That was already the case before the pandemic. To what extent was this accelerated system-wide during the pandemic is a really interesting question to which I don't have a full answer. We'll need a lot more time to answer that. But at the very least, what I hope the chapter flags is what lessons can be learned from that. It's difficult to burden share, even among close intelligence allies. There's a lot of stuff the US doesn't share with Canada, and there's a lot of stuff we don't share. That's perfectly normal, even with closest allies. But could we do a bit more post-pandemic? Probably. So there are interesting lessons to learn here.
Fantastic. That's a great response. We have another question in as well. And this will probably be our last question. We'll probably take a little bit of a break before we go on to the second panel. And so this question comes from Christopher Ankerson, and he asks, moving beyond, what are the ethical challenges of increasing the scope of existing intelligence apparatus internally within the domestic domain? Put another way, has the focus been on what we can do, vice what ought we do? So Amar, if I could turn to you first to perhaps take a stab at that.
No, I'll jump in on that question. Thanks, Carol. So we do actually have a chapter that looks on the ethics at issue, and this is written by Jess Davis and Alex Corbet, where they look at the intelligence community and whether it is appropriate to extend in the intelligence apparatus in this fashion from an ethical standpoint. So they do look at that, and they weigh the issues, and to be fair, as most ethical questions are asked, it is inconclusive to date, but they do ask that question. And certainly when we're talking about those communities that are most at risk, at least in this pandemic, we saw that the communities most at risk early on, especially, were those communities of color, right? Communities, migrant community, refugee communities, right? And marginalized communities for various regions, right? Including Indigenous communities within Canada. So the idea of then targeting enhanced surveillance at these communities, especially, is problematic. One, not because they have been historically targeted by law enforcement and the intelligence community for surveillance to and increase. Not only that, but it also could potentially have negative ramifications for the interaction with those communities in the national security community down the road, right? And so do we want to increasingly securitize those communities most at risk in a pandemic? What are the implications for that? And there are several, and the chapter does look at that. So I think that's a great question, and something that needs to be top of mind. And this is why I say, when we're talking about the big questions, privacy versus surveillance, enforcement versus letting liberty, right? We need to have these conversations in advance of a pandemic. So we have a sense of where the balance lies, what the ethical dilemmas are. So we're not asking these when we're trying to implement necessary measures to save lives.
Thank you. And I think that first question, talking about lethality, drives the point as even further home. And hopefully, we'll be able to have some deeper discussions about capturing those lessons learned as we move forward. I am going to conclude our panel. We don't have any further questions at present, so I'm just mindful of giving everyone sort of a 5-minute pause before we go on to the next panel, which Stephanie will lead for us. So thank you again to our panel presenters. Fascinating discussion about the role of intelligence and national security. And we're having some of the same discussions here in the United States, and I just concluded a big panel on this very topic. So it's interesting to see the parallels that we're experiencing across our communities. And with that, let me turn it over to, I believe, Stephanie.
Actually, it's Colonel Teller here, MC. I'll take it over from here. So Dr. Evans and our panelists, thank you for a wonderfully insightful discussion. We will take a few minutes and reconvene at 12:05 to start with panel number 2. So I will see you then.